How do organisations create a culture where people feel safe to speak up? When the world around us is feeling really noisy at times, full of debate, often there are many aspirations of organisations to create a speak-up culture or a climate of voice can remain unfulfilled, and instead a climate of silence prevails. And that's what Helene and I are here to talk about today. We're intrigued about why it can be so hard to create a climate of voice, and how can we unlock the opportunity for people to use and own their own voices inside the workplace? And what are the barriers that can make that so hard to do? So my name is Tracy Groves. I'm here with Helene Smith from Red Lion Consulting. We're delighted to have this opportunity to really explore what this is all about, what it takes to build a climate of voice in the workplace, and what are the barriers that can prevent it happening. And we'd love to share with you some of our best practice experiences, our tools and techniques that we use that can help to drive a real improvement in culture and behaviours in the workplace. We're going to have a conversation which I hope will provide some insight. We'd love to share with you what we've learned and what we're continuing to learn through our work with Red Lion Consulting and our clients. So let me tell you a bit about myself, first of all, before we start. So I run my own boutique consultancy called Intelligent Ethics, and part of my portfolio is working with Red Lion Consulting. I'm a former partner at PwC, and my passion is around hardwiring corporate integrity into the workplace. How can businesses and organisations really think about and bring to life what doing the right thing means, not just through the controls and the processes, but through leadership conduct and the culture of the workplace? So that's what I do, and I'm really delighted to introduce Helene Smith here alongside me. Helene, tell me a bit about you and what you do, and what drives you.
So I'm in South Africa, and I've run a little business called Feather Learning for the last 30 years. I have worked particularly in organizations trying to deal with the psychology of individuals in the workplace, and largely actually what we call depth psychology, the under the surface processes that go on in the workplace. And I work in a variety of organizations, whether government organizations, more corporates, or even some small startup organizations who may need to get their people processes kick-started at the beginning.
Yeah, really fascinating in terms of how you approach this during that, using that psychological lens. And what does climate of voice mean to you, Helene?
Well, it's one of those complex concepts that we can say in a short little phrase, but it's a whole deep process, because of course it's a lifelong journey for everybody to find their voice. You know, we start off when we're little trying to find a voice, and then through various social situations, we have to find out who we are, what's our identity, how we can speak authentically, and how we can even speak about difficult things in an organization. And that, I think, for some people takes a lifetime to learn.
Yeah. It's interesting as you position it as something to learn, but it can be hard to do, can't it? As we both know, through working with organisations, are really trying hard to create a place where people feel safe to do so. What do you think are some of the barriers or challenges that can make it hard to do?
Well, it starts, my work is psychological, so I tend to look at where it all starts. And we know that if you grow up as part of a demographically marginalised group, or a group that, or even in a family, you grow up in an environment where you're not that powerful for whatever reason, right from the start of your life, it's hard to speak up. It's hard to say, this is who I am, because there may be all sorts of cultural barriers, there may be social barriers, and those then continue into the workplace later on. And of course, in some situations, it's dangerous to speak up. People don't want you naming some practices that they may be trying to hide. So they kind of internal barriers where, because of your history, you've learned not to speak up, but there are also external barriers that the organization wouldn't want you to speak up. So those are maybe two of the groups.
Yeah. I just thinking about, as you were speaking, I was thinking of an example of a client that I've worked with recently, and they had established a pretty well, robust process around the ability to raise a concern or consult with an independent speak-up line, as they called it, if they were, in thinking about how did this align with our values, and this felt inappropriate in terms of the way people were conducting themselves. And the challenge that they had was, they said, no one's using it. Tracy, we've advertised it, we've talked about it, we've put it out there in terms of this being a safe place to do, but nobody feels that they can put their trust in the process and allow themselves to use it. And it was really interesting, and I worked with them, and we uncovered this real sense of fear, but also futility. That's the other kind of thing that came up really strongly, because they had observed other people in the workplace whereby if they had spoken up and if they had challenged the status quo, nothing happened.
Yes.
You know, really, it was kind of swept under the carpet. Like you said, there's kind of like that motivated blindness. We don't want to know what's going on, so therefore we'll dismiss it and we won't give it credence. And I think that feels people, you know, with the opposite of trust, it's kind of a bit of despair, isn't it? It's a bit of things, well, what's the point? So it took a long time for them to start, and actually what I encouraged them to do was to start the really positive storytelling about when people had the confidence and the courage and things had been listened to and respected and responded to. And actually it started to shift, but this stuff doesn't happen overnight, does it? I'm sure you'll agree. As you say, it's a lifetime of having the confidence to do it.
And some of the difficulty is if you've had a lifetime of having your voice silenced or marginalized because you may have a demographic, you know, in certain cultures, it still matters if you're a woman, it still matters if you're a Black person, and you don't get an opportunity to speak up. So it may take a long time to overcome one's own internal experiences of nobody's going to listen, the internal sense of futility.
Never mind the external pressure as well.
You've got all of those pressures going on. And so very often it's a long empowerment process to help people to speak up. But as long as the organization is very consistent in terms of how they respond, and they seem to respond to anybody who does speak up, it starts making a big difference.
Yeah. You've just triggered and reminded me, Helene, of a piece of research that was done here in the UK at the beginning of this year about ethnic minorities and the ability for those with different backgrounds to speak up. And I've got the stats written down here. And if you're a person of, you know, if you're a Black person, you are 13%, you know, more likely to not speak up. You know, you won't feel empowered and have that confidence to do so. And if you're from an Asian background, 8%, you know, more likely to remain silent. You know, so there's this massive imbalance. And, you know, what we're doing is effectively blocking off a significant part of our workforce, effectively, if we're not allowing different parts to be able to have that voice that they can own.
And I guess in other countries, I mean, I think in South Africa, the stats would be higher, even though we're in, you know, we've got a new government and things are different. There's still a bit of a culture of people needing to find their voices because they've been so silenced for so long. So I would imagine across the world, those figures may be higher.
So what are some of the tools and techniques that you use then, Helene, in your work with your clients and the business that you work with? What are the kind of frameworks or techniques that you use? I'm sure you've got many, but what are the ones that you know really cause a drive and a shift in mindset?
Well, I suppose one of the main ones is what I call psychological literacy development. So helping people understand their own histories, understand why they may be reluctant to speak up. So really getting to know their internal worlds and building enough self-awareness that they can identify their own internal obstacles. And the psychological literacy gives them some psychological concepts, a kind of a roadmap or a guidebook to navigating their own internal anxiety, defenses, and obstacles. That's kind of working with the individual. So, and one would work at two ends. You'd work at the individual end, but you'd also then look at what goes on in the group culture of the organization. So once you've worked individually, to develop an approach in the group culture that identifies the obstacles. And some of that is in a form that we call group processes. So it's conversations where the organization then turns that self-reflective lens on itself and says, what goes on here that stops us? Because as you were speaking earlier, all organizations have a difference between what we call their espoused values and their values in use. So what they say they're going to do and what actually happens in practice, of course, not the same thing. And we help to close that gap through in-depth conversations.
And that disconnect is where the fear, you know, get created, where the anxiety massively is amplified, isn't it? And it's that gap that can cause so many chasms, literally, in terms of the ability to execute what you say and what you do.
And part of the problem is that the gaps are undiscussable. So it may not be able to be talked about. If you do talk about it, you're discussing the thing that nobody really wants to talk about. So that in itself is risky, to be able to name that there's a difference between what we say we're going to do and what we actually do.
And That's exactly, if I think about some of the practical things that I do to support organisations, one of the things it's so compelling and so powerful is the ability to have a difficult conversation. You know, it feels like, well, surely we know how to do that, especially, you know, amongst the more senior individuals, amongst the leadership group. But actually, it's hard to be able to look people in the face and to talk about the undiscussables, as you were saying, and to do it in a way that's constructive, that's not blaming or shaming, but, you know, collaborative in order to come to a better outcome for everyone. So one of the programs that I've been running is about how do you initiate that? What's your vocabulary? How do you frame it in a way so that it becomes positive and it feels like a win-win situation, as opposed to trying to find out, you know, who's done what and what's, you know, and who's going to get punished as a consequence of doing that. But it's really hard because, you know, just being able to simplify it and break it down actually can really unlock some of the internal barriers you were talking about.
And one of the approaches I take is that to get those conversations going is to do the psychological literacy bit about power dynamics. So people really understand the impact of power dynamics and dealing with people with more power and how that can affect the communication. Once they have a bit of theory about that and they have some practice around dealing with people in a power imbalance, then it really assists them to close that gap.
Yeah.
So I very much try and work with capacity building. So building people's knowledge of what's going on and why it's going on, and then helping them to develop some tools to address it.
Yeah, yeah. One of the clients that I've been working with, we've created what we've called effectively a guardian scheme. And it goes down to, you know, what works in your culture within your landscape you're operating in, but they have elected and self-selected individuals who they see to be those who can really support in the workplace the ability to speak up. So they've trained and equipped these guardians yet to really support, give confidence, very confidentially as well. So it's nothing that's going to be necessarily, you know, formalized, but actually it's helped people just this to become part of the everyday dialogue. Because speak up, and it's really interesting this, it doesn't always have to be negative, does it? You know, speaking up can be actually about, what about doing something different that can create a better outcome? You know, what about being more creative or more innovative, or trying something different that can lead to improvements? And unfortunately, the experience has been, it's always been seen to be something which has gone wrong or not so good. So it has that negative bias that drags it down and makes it not something that we feel comfortable with.
Yeah. It even goes down to just people providing simple information.
Yeah.
That if there isn't a speak up culture, just non-negative information gets held back on.
Yeah.
So it's quite critical to develop that culture of voice, to, I suppose, in a way that the culture of voice is the lubrication for the entire organizational system.
I like that. I love that phrase.
And if we don't, so yes, so it, like you say, it has those positive impacts too.
Yeah. So what would you say, leading to my final question, Helene, what would you say are the kind of success factors? What do you look for? What changes as a consequence of what you do? The kind of so what question, if I may put it like that.
Well, the first thing that changes is the way the individual relates to themselves in the organization. So the internal relationship changes, and you notice people often build more self-esteem. They have a sense of their contribution and their value to the organization because they feel more empowered. And what also changes is the way information flows in the organization and the kinds of things that are spoken about. The conversation changes. So it tends to move from being more task focused, which of course is necessary, to more process focused, a kind of what we call a meta communication starts of how are we doing and are we able to speak, and people start talking about how things are improving. And you see it visibly in the energy levels in the group, because of course, if you're not being silenced, the energy starts flowing and there's a lot more energy available for things like innovation.
I absolutely agree with you in terms of the noise levels, the kind of, you know, the momentum, the dynamics shift. Obviously, we're living in a bit of a different world now where we're a bit physically disconnected and we're not able to maybe tap into that so much. But absolutely, one of the key observations I always seem to make is actually people are just swapping ideas, questioning, challenging. They're actually, the curiosity score, as I call it, goes through the roof in a way that doesn't actually hold you back. It accelerates things. You know, it really helps to elevate the conversation to much more, as you say, about, well, this is brilliant, but I'm sure we could do it even better if. And that seemed to be something that's welcomed and embraced as well. And I think, you know, one of the things that I hear, particularly in one of the sectors I work with within financial services, where, you know, I did a piece of research with the London Business School many years ago, which is why you can't scare bankers into doing the right thing. You know, which is, you cannot keep on saying more rules, more controls, more policies, more processes are going to create a culture where people do feel that psychological safety, as you say, and do feel that if they were to speak up, it would be welcomed and valued and respected. And actually, you know, this ability to not scare, but actually unlock and tap and inspire people to want to have the conversation. And actually, at times, it's quite moving to see that change and that shift takes place as well. Yeah.
I worked with an MBA class many years ago, and one of my students didn't speak up for the entire year. She was in the back of the class, she was present, I could see that she was really participating, but she wasn't actually using her voice.
Right.
And it was important for me to recognize that for some people it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And it was in the last minute of the last class that she eventually put her hand up and said why she hadn't spoken for the whole year, that it was a really hard thing for her to do. But it's allowing the time for somebody to find their voice. And of course, we try and do it as quickly as possible, but sometimes it's about creating the enabling environment where somebody can step into it themselves rather than being kind of guided by systems and structures and processes.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate process in some ways. Yeah. And having I suppose, a respect for what it takes really assists clients in finding their voice.
Yeah, yeah. And I think being able to tack into that individual's sense of dignity, you know, their real sense of value and worth, which is, it's okay not to be constantly, you know, here's me speaking as an extrovert here and always just articulating whatever comes into my head, but actually respecting that person's space and that time needed to be able to acquire it and use it in a way that they feel comfortable with. Yeah. Helene, it's fantastic hearing your experiences and your perspectives. I'm really excited about the fact that we're working together, because actually we're all after the same thing, particularly in terms of what you and I are trying to do. From what I learn and what I understand from hearing from you speak, your huge experience in applying this psychological lens into it, you know, thinking about the internal and intrinsic barriers and also unblockers that you can help people come to terms with and use to their utmost. And my approach, I hope, will be very much kind of thinking about this from a practical corporate governance perspective and how we can really hardwire this into the business, but more importantly, think how leaders can take accountability and responsibility to make this happen to the best that they can possibly be.
And I think what excites me about it is that you come with so many years of practical experience and working at corporate level, where you are unlocking things. But I get the sense when I talk to you that you bring all that experience to bear in all of your interactions, and you can bring a multiple set of tools to any case that you might have to deal with. And I might work a bit more psychologically, and you might work a bit more with systems and structures, but together there's quite a lot of synchronicity.
Absolutely. Helene, I can't wait till we work together again on our next project. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.